Hi everyone, it's Kirstine from the Mustard Tree Trust. Hello everyone, it's lovely to see you. I thought we'd start a new series about the heroes in the Old Testament in the Bible. So the first one we're going to look at is a man called Moses. Now Moses is one of these heroes. He had a tough life and he did as God asked him. He was known as a friend of God. Imagine that. He spent time talking to God just like you would talk to your friend. He was born into a Hebrew family who lived in Egypt. Now, the king of Egypt is called a pharaoh, and he was scared of the Hebrews because there were so many of them in his land, and he was worried that if they went to war, they would join with the enemy and fight against them. So the king decided that he would turn them into slaves and try and kill lots of their babies. But Moses was rescued by the king's own daughter. That meant he grew up in a palace and grew up a bit like a prince. But he always knew that he was a Hebrew. Now one day he did something bad and he ended up running away from his family and friends and went to a place called Midian. There he met a lady called Zipporah, and as things happen, he fell in love and married her. Now her father was in need of a shepherd, so Moses became a shepherd and he worked for him. Can you imagine that? A boy who'd been brought up in a palace working as a shepherd? I wonder if he was any good. However, Moses still remembered that he was a Hebrew, and many years later, God called him to do a different job. God called him to be a great leader, not to look after sheep, but to look after people. God wanted him to rescue the Hebrews in Egypt. So this meant he had to go back and face the new king, who Moses probably knew because they probably grew up together. Moses didn't really want to. In fact, Moses tried several times not to go. And in the end, God said he would take his brother Aaron with him. So we're going to add some actions to the story. Are you ready? When I say, and God said, I want you to go, let my people go. Should we try that? And God said, let my people go. Brilliant. And Aaron was Moses' brother. And the sign for brother in Makaton is brother. So when I say Aaron, we're going to make the sign for brother. Okay? Are you ready? By the time Moses returned to Egypt, things were much worse for the Hebrew people. Now the new Pharaoh had them working to build great cities, and they were treated very cruelly. He met up with his brother Aaron, and they told Pharaoh that the Hebrews wanted to go out into the desert to worship God. Moses said to him, God says, let my people go. Did you remember to do it? But Pharaoh said, no, why should I? I don't want to lose my workforce. So Aaron tried. If you don't let them go, God will bring down lots of plagues on this country. A plague is something that overruns the whole country. It's usually either disease or insects or something like that. Maybe a little bit like COVID. Pharaoh still said no. So the next morning when he got up to go and have his bath, he went to the River Nile. Moses and Aaron met him. God says, let my people go. But Pharaoh said, no. So Aaron took his stick and held it over the river, and it turned into blood. It stayed like this for 7 days. Can you imagine the smell? And then Moses and Aaron went up to Pharaoh and said, God says, let my people go. or the country will be overrun by frogs." Pharaoh said, "No." And so the land became covered in frogs. The Bible says they were in the palace, in the bedrooms, and even on Pharaoh's bed. Then all the Egyptian houses, in their ovens, in their bread-making troughs, it must have been awful. Well, you can imagine Pharaoh wasn't very happy. So he called for Moses and Aaron and said, "Please pray for these frogs to be taken away, and then I'll let your people go and worship God." So Moses did. He prayed to God, and all of the frogs either died or went back into the river. Those that had died were cleaned up and put in a big heap, and the whole land reeked of them. Smelly. But once Pharaoh was clear of the frogs, he changed his mind. So Moses and Aaron had to go again to the palace and tell Pharaoh that God says, "Let my people go." Can you guess how many times this happened? Once more? Twice more? Well, in total, God sent blood and frogs and gnats, which are like little biting flies. He sent big flies, a disease on all the sheep and the cows, boils, which are like hard lumps of yucky stuff on your skin, and hail so hard that it killed everything that was outside, including animals and the crops. He then sent locusts, which are like big grasshoppers, to eat what was left of the crops. And then he sent darkness. So that's 9 already. But the 10th one was the worst. You see, in the end, God did something so awful that Pharaoh did let the Hebrews go. God told the Hebrews to have a special meal of lamb and to use the blood from that lamb to paint it over the doorways. If they did that, then the angel that God was going to send would pass over that house. If they didn't, and of course the Egyptian people didn't, then the oldest child in every house would be killed. That must have been awful. And in the end, Pharaoh did let God's people go. So the Hebrews escaped. All of them with their animals and belongings, they set off out of Egypt. The Hebrew people went round and round and camped in the desert for a few days, and then guess what happened? Pharaoh changed his mind again. He sent out 600 of his best chariots and his army to fight the Hebrew people and to get them to come back. Well, when the Hebrews saw them approaching, they were terrified. Let me see your frightened faces. But they didn't need to be, because God had a plan. Now, God had been using a cloud to go in front of the Hebrew people so that they knew where to go. And God told Moses to go ahead of the cloud and to hold his stick over the Red Sea. That was the sea that was in front of them. So Moses did. And amazingly, the water started to move, and it grew 2 huge walls of water, and in the middle there was dry land. The Hebrew people were able to walk through on dry land. And God moved the big cloud to the back of the Hebrew people. So the Egyptians on one side of the cloud, it was dark like it was nighttime. But the Hebrew people on the other side of the cloud, it was like daylight, so they could see to walk across. By the next morning, the whole group of Hebrews had walked through, all 1.5 million of them. But the Egyptians were still following, so they weren't safe yet. So Moses was told to stretch his hand back over the sea. And when he did, the big walls of water crashed down and they killed everybody in the middle, which of course was the Egyptian army. The Hebrews were free at last, and God had provided them with a leader and a path out of their suffering. Now, Jewish people today still celebrate this time. They call it Passover because the angel passed over their houses. They have a special meal with lamb and remember the story of the people who were set free by a great leader. But that story tells us a bit more, doesn't it? It tells us that God looked after his people and that God used Moses to help him. Moses was rescued as a baby. He grew up in a palace so he'd understand when he needed to come back and see the Pharaoh how to do it and how to behave. He became a shepherd and learned how to care for things. And then he led God's people away from the cruelty of their employers and into their own land. And Pharaoh had to learn that God was much more powerful than any man. And when God said, "Let my people go," he meant it. Well, I hope you enjoyed that story. We'll look at another Old Testament hero next week. But for now, bye.